Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin Daf Kafav. We actually have a very straightforward sugya in terms of structure, and the study guide will help you. So you can always go back and see the structure, and I'll review it as we go along as well, but it's very helpful to see where we're going. It basically breaks down into two charts that you'll see the structure kind of repeats itself. There's two different structures today, and with that, we'll get started. The Mishnah starts with nechasim sheyesh lam achrayut niknim bekesef b'shtar b'chazaka. So we've done a woman is acquired in three ways and gets out of it, etc. Then we did, also other kinds of marriage relationships. Then we did Eved Ivri, Jewish slave. Then we did Eved Knani. Then we went to animals. Now we're going to go to land and movable property. So nechasim that have achrayut. What does it mean they have achrayut? They have a guarantee or they have responsibility associated with them. What is that? That's land. And Rashi says, Hainu karkaot. Why is karkaot called? This is basically, instead of saying karka, they say nechsim sheyesh lam achrayut. Okay, it could be also potentially houses. She'achrayut kol adam haloveh v'hanoshe b'chavero alehen. That means that when you take a loan, your property is a guarantee for your loan. If you don't pay back, they'll take it from your land. Why specifically land is used for this? Because if I lend money to you, I know that I have what to rely on. If you have a car, your car could get, crash, and something might happen to it. Or, if you have, an iPad that could easily break or get lost. But land isn't going to get lost. It's not going to break. Now, it could be land could go down in value, but I know that you have land, that there's always some sort of value to land. In fact, today we'll see, like even rocky land has some value to it. But therefore, that's called, it comes with responsibility because it's something that I can use, and I can rely on, okay, to get payback for a loan. So how is land acquired? Okay, it's a complicated way to say land. Okay, so how is land acquired? Bekesef b'shtar ub'chazaka, with money, with a document, or with chazaka. What is chazaka? Either I work the land, in some way I show ownership on the land. Later we'll see it's even I could just settle in the land. I can sit there, live there. I can bring a pillow and a blanket and start sleeping there. And that is a type of way of acquiring the land. Okay, we'll get to, how long do you need to just be living in the land until you can prove that it's yours? That's all a separate thing. That's in Cheskad Abatim and Baba Batra. We have a lot of time to get there. But generally, it means you're doing something to show ownership of the land. Now, again, I want to remind you, what does it mean, niknim? It means that once we do this, it's a point of no return. When we have a kinyan, it means that we can't change our minds about this anymore. You think about it a lot these days when you order on Amazon, right? And then you push to finish the deal. And then a minute later you say, oh no, wait, I did something wrong, or right, I didn't want that, or whatever it might be. And then you're stuck really, right? You could try to cancel it. It's very hard to cancel orders these days. I mean, obviously you can always try to return it, but it's always very hard. As soon as you have this half-hour window, or sometimes you don't even have that half-hour window. They already say, oh, sorry, we've dealt with it. It's processed and there's nothing you can do about it. So basically, right, that's the idea of the point of no return, where you've basically agreed. So either by handing over the money when it comes to land, or by handing over rent. This would be the different person hands over the money. Handing over the money would be the buyer. The handing over the shtar would be the seller hands it over to the buyer. Or chazaka, which is, we do some sort of act of showing I have ownership, right? The buyer would do some sort of act of I own this land and starts planting there, plowing there, whatever it might be. V'she'en lahem achrayut. If it doesn't have achrayut, which basically is another word for saying metal to the movable property, ein niknim ela b'mishicha. The only way to acquire it is actually by pulling it. Okay, if you pull the object, or like we talked about yesterday, perhaps just lifting it, right? But pulling it is a way of showing ownership. If I don't pull the object, now we talked about this yesterday, the pulling would have to happen not in the seller's domain, but pulling it into my own domain, or an area which is kind of neutral, like the sides of Reshut HaRabim, of the public thoroughfare. Nechasim she'en lehem achrayut, niknim im nechasim sheyesh lehem achrayut. Okay, now, we just talked about that. Okay, maybe we didn't specify this clearly enough, but the ways in which you acquire land are different than the ways that you acquire movable property. And they're not the same at all. There's no crossover. They're two totally different tracts, and you could do the same thing. You could pay money for metaltalin. That's not going to do the sale. That doesn't mean it's a done deal. Okay. Whereas if you do it with land, it's a done deal. However, even though they have different methods of acquiring, if you have, let's say I'm buying your land and some movable property in your land, let's say some furniture or whatever it might be, or some jugs. So, nechasim she'en lahem achrayut, movable property, niknim im nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut bekesef b'shtar b'chazaka. So if I buy your house and with it comes all this furniture and a whole bunch of other things, as soon as I make we do an act of acquiring the land, which is effective for the land, the metaltalin are included as well. Now, I give an example where the stuff was in the house. What if we were making a deal about some movable property you have somewhere else and land that you have in a different place? Is it the same thing? Would it work? That's going to be a question the Gemara is going to ask. Does it have to be that the metaltalin are in the property? Or could they even be somewhere else, but because we made a deal about both things, therefore, it's going to cover our act of acquiring that works for land is going to cover the metaltalin as well. So that's a question that we're only going to get to the answer tomorrow. We're going to try a few sources to get to that answer today, but we won't have an answer by the end of today's daf. And another thing, which we'll only really deal with tomorrow, which is zokikin, last line in the Mishnah, zokikin tenechasim sheyesh lam achrayut lishava alehem. If we're already talking about differences between movable property and non-movable property, land and movables, so there's another difference between them, which is, and this is kind of different because this exists by metaltalin, not by land. The other one existed by land and not metaltalin, which is the ways to acquire land are not the same as metaltalin, but yet they could cover metaltalin. Generally, you might remember from Gitin, we don't like people to take oaths. We want to minimize oaths as much as we can. It's always kind of scary to take an oath. You use the name of God and all that. But there are cases where oaths are required. So one of the cases, for example, is a movable miksa. We talked about this also, which is we have a claim. You claim that I owe you X amount of money. And I say, I agree that I owe you, that I borrowed that amount of money from you, but I already pay back half. Okay, so now I am obligated by law to take a shvuah movable miksa because we suspect that I'm really lying, that I really wanted to say I don't owe you anything, but I was too embarrassed to say that in front of you. So I actually just, to push you off, I said, oh, I already paid you back half, hoping that would push you off a little bit. But we actually think I'm lying, and therefore we make me take an oath to really say, I don't owe you that half. And if I take the oath, then I actually don't have to pay you the half. But other than that, I don't. I have to pay you. So now, movable miksa, that kind of an oath, can only be taken on movable property. It doesn't exist by land. There is no such thing as movable miksa when it comes to land. However, if we're having an argument that covers both movable and land, even though normally I wouldn't take an oath on land. So let's say you say that I owe you a field and I owe you 2 jugs. And I say I only owe you 1 jug and I don't owe you the land. So now I wouldn't have to swear on the land normally, but since I'm already swearing on the jug, therefore I swear on the land as well. That's called zokikin. That means we zokikin, we put it together. In other words, because what's the issue with an oath? We don't want you to take the name of God in vain. But once you've already used God's name to take an oath for the metaltalin, so you don't have to say, I swear in the name of God about the metaltalin, I swear in the name of God about the land. You would just say one oath in the name of God, and then we can just include all sorts of other things. Tomorrow's daf, we're going to say, well, where do we get this from? We actually got it from the Sota. When she says, Amen, Amen, you might remember that. We saw it in Sota, but that's where the source of this law comes. So now with the Mishnah, what the Gemara is going to do on all these and even into tomorrow's daf, which is start with each line in the Mishnah. And sometimes it might just be a word like kesef, shtar, right? And we already know this this is what we've been doing since the beginning of the Masechet. This item is acquired by this method. How do we know? What's our source? So we're going to go through one by one, the source for everything. And in addition, the first, like certainly in the first kesef and shtar, we're going to also have a limitation of this, where it's not always true, okay? So we're going to start with the question. In each section, we're going to start, where do we get this from? You can see that on the first chart on the study guide, that there's this question, where does it come from? And they're going to bring up a pasuk, and there might be a little bit of a discussion about the source. Bekesef minala, where do we get that you can acquire with money alone? Amar Chizkiah, Amar Kra, Sadot Bakesef Yiknu. This is a pasuk from Yirmiyahu. You might remember, we've talked about this before also, especially Masechet Gitin. Yirmiyahu had this, I think it was his cousin, not his uncle, I think it was a cousin. Anyway, cousin or uncle, his name was Hanamel. Yirmiyahu had a prophecy from God that he was supposed to buy this land from Hanamel. We're talking about right before the destruction, not the best time to be buying real estate. And the whole point was he was trying to say, right, and then the prophecy is that eventually the Jews are going to come back to this land and they're going to buy fields. And it was what we call a nivuat nechama, one of those good nivuot, that things will eventually be better. And at the end of that chapter, here comes the prophecy. It's actually kind of separated from the beginning of the chapter where he actually does the whole acquiring. But he tells the people, Sadot bakesef yiknu, you will buy fields with money. So what do you see here? You'll buy fields with money. That means money buys fields, because the word kinyan, which is the word for acquiring, goes together with money. Happens to be the next words are, and this is why it's a little bit tricky, v'chatov v'sefer v'chaton. This is why we brought it up in Gitim, because it was talking about, right, is chatima the important part of the writing, right, or is it not? Anyway, it says, write it in a book and sign it, okay? And you will write it in a book and you will sign it, meaning document. So it's a little bit weird. It sounds like you need money and a document. Okay, I want you to just think about what we do nowadays. When you do a closing on a house, what do? You sign, first of all, and you give money. If you don't put money down at that point, then it's not a done deal, right? That's how you can understand this from our life. We do kesef and shtar together. And that's why, in fact, it makes sense that you do both. So the Gemara is going to say, ve'ema adi shtar, but maybe kesef isn't enough without the shtar, because look at the next part of that pasuk. Dichtiv v'chatov v'sefer v'chatom. It's very nice. You said sadot b'kesef yiknu, and often the Gemara, you might notice, they sometimes intentionally cut the rest of the pasuk and don't show you the whole thing, because they're concerned with those three words. But the person on the other side is smarter than that and says, but what about the rest of the pasuk? It says you'll acquire fields and you'll sign documents about them. So doesn't it sound like you need both this and that? To which they answer, no. Because iktiv yiknu levasov kidka marta. Hasha diktiv yiknu meikara kesef kane shtar ra'aya ba'am. Shtar we've talked about before. There's two kinds of documents. One is a document that affects the sale. And one is a document that's just coming to prove something. Where did that come up? In get, for example. A get is not a document that proves we got divorced. A get is a document that affects the divorce. Without that giving of the document, there's no divorce. But they're going to say here that the document in a sale is only proof that there was an acquiring with money. Okay, now, again, nowadays, usually you sign and then you transfer money, I think. I don't remember anymore. But, it's really that you sign. The signing is, okay, now we're agreeing. And then the money is to seal the deal. But here they're saying it's really the opposite. And how do we know it? Because the pasuk didn't write it in that order. If it wanted to be like us, you would say, sign the document and then pass over the money. But because it starts with the money, they say the document is just proof for the sale, that the sale was done. It's just so you have something in hand, but it doesn't affect anything. In which case, we've now proven that all you need is money alone. Amarav, now we're going to get, so that was our source. We had a question about it. Maybe that pasuk would actually prove you need two things together. No, it doesn't. Now, Amarav. Rav now wants to limit this halacha. Amarav, Loshanu ela, and this would help us for nowadays. Bimakom she'en kotvim tashta. This is only in a place where they don't generally write documents to affect the sale. Now, what's the whole deal about the sale being affected? Well, the question is, it's what we call in Hebrew gemirat da'at, which means we assume that when we do a certain action, I intended, in order for a sale to happen, it has to be that the seller actually agrees to pass it over and they're finished, right? They're done with it. I can remember when I bought my house, the woman who was selling the house did not want to sell it. She was having second thoughts at the end. I remember discussing this in class at some point. And she really didn't want to sign. It was Tanit Esther. It was almost time for Megillah reading, and we had a shul, and we had to get back and run this, and she just wasn't signing. And right, because at that moment she was going through the Gemirat Dat. She had agreed before, but it's only when at the very last moment when you say, okay, I'm willing to part with this item and I will pass over the house to you. So it's all dependent on what's going on in the mind of the seller. Did they really mean to give it to you or not? So the question is it when you pass over the money that they've agreed? Or do you also need a document? Well, that sort of depends on what your society is used to, right? So our society has it that there's a document signed and money passed over. So if you live in a place where that's the way they do it, then if you just passed over money but didn't write the document, that's nothing. It doesn't mean, again, what does it mean nothing? It means any side can change their mind and back out. So, so if it's a place where they generally write documents, then again, it's a matter of what the seller thinks. The seller, right, when she was signing that document, she knew that that was the point of no return. So that's why she was having such a hard time signing it, right? But if that's not the point of no return in general in your community, then it's not so hard for them to do it, and they don't really mean to pass it over to you. V'i parish. However, if we made a special arrangement, then we can make any arrangement we want. If we make an arrangement, the kesef is going to sign the deal by itself, it will. If we make an arrangement, the shtar, we can do that. Okay, we can make our own agreement because again, it all depends on what's in the mind of the seller. So here's an example. He had Rav Idrav, and here's an example of someone who did it a little bit differently. And he said the following. It's actually a little confusing. He says, Kizavin Ara, when he bought land, he said, Amal. Now, you have to realize he had already passed over the money, but they hadn't written the document. So he said to the guy, as they were making the arrangement, I'm going to call the shots here. If I want, I can say that the kesef acquired it and it's a done deal. If I want, I can say that the shtar is what affects it, the deal, which means that it's not a done deal yet. Now, why would he do either? Well, if I want, I could say kesef seals the deal. Because I could, let's say you try to renege. I can say, no, kesef did the deal and it's too late at this point. And if I want, I can say, oh no, it's not a deal until the shtar is signed. And why would I do that? Because if I want to change my mind, that'll still give me the opportunity to change my mind. So basically, it must have been that the seller was desperate to sell and agreed to this because this is a bit of an unfair agreement. But the point is that if he agreed. And then in this case, Rav Idi Baravin was able to call the shots and say whichever one he wanted could affect the sale depending on, how he wanted it to work to his advantage. So again, let's just review. We started with what's the source for kesef. We tried to suggest maybe you need shtar also. We said no. But then Rav comes and says, by the way, this whole halacha is only in a place where they don't affect kinyanim with shtarot, okay, with documents. But when they do, then you actually need both. Okay, or theoretically, you could make your own arrangement. B'shtar minala. Now we're going on to shtar. What's the source? So they say, Elema, if you want to say, Mishum dichtiv v'chatov v'sefer v'chatom v'ha'ed edim, which was the pasuk we just quoted. Well, we know we can't use that pasuk because what did we just say about that pasuk? That pasuk is only saying that the shtar is a proof of the deal. That shtar is not affecting a kinyan, not an act of acquiring. So you can't say that, right? Because that would be the obvious pasuk. It says it right there in the context of the sale of land. So they say, but we just said that the shtar there is only a proof of the sale that was done already with the money. So let's find another pasuk, interestingly enough, in that same chapter, in the beginning of the chapter, when Yirmiyahu buys the land from his cousin. Yirmiyahu says, and I will take the book of sale, because he was buying the land. Remember, the seller gives him the book of sale, which is the document. And what is it called? Mikneh. Mikneh is acquiring. So there you see that shtar could use to acquire. Amar Shmuel, again, we're going to have now a limitation of this halacha. Lo shanu ela b'shtar matana. Now, this is a very big limiting. He says, this is only, big qualification. He says, this is only in a gift. In a gift, a shtar seals the deal. Aval b'mechel lo kana ad shiten lo damin. But with a sale, it doesn't work until you give the money. So let's say, right, let's go back to when that woman was selling me the house. So she signed her name and I signed my name, but, and she gives me the document. But if I didn't give any money yet, then both of us could actually still change our minds. Okay. When it comes to a sale, so it's interesting. We're now saying shtar works only if it's a gift. Okay. And then again, a gift, what would it mean? It would mean I can't change my mind once I give you the document. That's because there is no money changing hands. But when money changes hands, you have to give the money because not really a deal until you give the money. Mativ Rav Hamnuna, remember him from yesterday, Hamnuna, Karnuna. So Rav Hamnuna comes in questions now, and he says, Vishtar Kitzad. Here we're quoting a Braita. It says, how do you affect a kinyan of land with a shtar? Katav lo ala niyar o ala chedes. You wrote it on a piece of parchment or on a piece of a shard of earthenware shard. Even though they're not worth anything. Okay, why that's here is a good question. The commentaries say we don't understand why that has to be added here. Because remember, we talked about that, right? That the shtar itself doesn't have value. It only has value in terms of what's written in it, but it itself doesn't have monetary value, or it doesn't necessarily. It could be written on something fancy that does, but usually it's not. So even if it doesn't, but you write sadi mechura lecha, sadi nituna lecha. And when you write, this is how you affect a kinyan b'shtar. You write, my field is sold to you. Notice it says sold. My field is given to you. That would be a language of a gift. Harezo mechura v'nituna. So if you said mechura, it would be sold. If you said nituna, it would be given as a gift. So that seems to say very clearly that even in a sale, you could do it just with a shtar. That seems to go against Shmuel. So Rav Hamnuna brought up this question, but who motiv lava who mefarik? He answered his own question. We're going to actually have two answers. One he answers, a different one Rav Ashi brings as an answer. Why does this not contradict the limitation that Shmuel set up? B'mocher sadeu mipnei ra'ata. If I am selling you land and I give you a document, and if I'm desperate to sell the land because the land is not great quality land, and I'm worried that you're going to change your mind about it, then again, this is like we said, parish. Now, you didn't, if you explicitly said it, or even if you didn't explicitly say it, but it's clear that in that case, I'm so desperate to get you that land so you don't change your mind because I really want to get rid of it. Then, and by the way, there's other reasons, not just because it's bad land. It could be desperate for money or something like that. But if I really want to make sure, then already when I just write the document, I intended to give it over to you. So when this source talked about sadim mechura lecha would work, it would only be in a case where I was desperate to sell the property. This is not a great answer because the source seemed very general, and neither is going to be the second answer is not going to be a great answer either, but that's typical when we have some Tannaitic source that contradicts the Amora, we try to give answers even though they might not be the strongest answers possible. Because it's pretty hard to get a good answer here because it does seem to say pretty clearly in that source that a shtar is enough to affect a kinyan. Next option, Rav Ashi Amar, when he said sadim mechura lecha, it actually wasn't really a sale. Okay, it was a gift. Well, it's a little bit weird, but b'matana bikesh litna though. He was really giving it to him as a gift. Okay, so this whole thing about how do you do it b'shtar is all talking about gifts. Why does it say then, lama katab bo lashon mecher? So why does it say, my field is sold to you if I was just giving it to you as a gift? Kedei liyapot et kocho. I wanted to give you strength in this gift. I wanted to say, I'm giving you this as a gift as if I sold it to you. What's the meaning of that? Well, let's say I owe money. And tomorrow, or a week later, or a year later, whatever it might be, someone comes to collect the loan and I don't have land. They might go take it from your gift. Now, what kind of a gift is that if tomorrow somebody might take it away from you? So what I wrote in the shtar is my shtar is sold to you so that you can come back later. If you come back and say, listen, you gave me this as a gift, I'll say, oh, too bad, sorry. What are you going to do? But if I wrote to you, this is sold to you, then I'm basically saying, and I'm taking responsibility for my gift, that if someone claims this land and takes it away from you, I'll pay you back the money. And that's why it was actually a gift, but it was in the language of a sale. So those are two ways to deal with Rav Hamnuna's difficulty. As I said, both of these are a little hard to read into that source. So again, in both cases, this part had the exact same structure. Kesef, where do we get it from? Shtar, where we get it from? And then a limitation on this halacha where, right, both cases, we ended up showing that in many, many cases, you actually need both shtar and money. And each one individually doesn't necessarily work. Now we're going to move on to b'chazaka. B'chazaka minalan, and here we're only going to have sources, and then we're going to move on. We're not going to have any limitations or anything. Again, chazaka is working the land, settling in the land, living there, something showing ownership. Minalan, where do we get it from? This time we're going to have two different possibilities of sources. You can try to think of what's the difference and why would one choose one over the other? The Gemara doesn't go into that, so I'll leave it for food for thought. Chizkiah says, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Ushvu ba'arichem asher tefastem. This is also from Yirmiyahu, by the way. And here's a case where, if you remember Tzom Gedalia and the whole story of Gedalia, so they were trying to make peace with the Babylonians, and people were upset with them that they were surrendering to them. And he says, look, they're giving us our chance to go back into our land, and let's go back and settle there. And he says, Shvu ba'arichem, go back to the cities asher tefastem, that you grabbed. What does it mean you grabbed? It means you settled them, right? Bamet tefastem b'yeshiva. How did you grab them? It means the places where you settled, where you sat and lived. So there we see that there's a kinyan on land by just being. To Bei Rabbi Ishmael Tana, a different source from the house of Rabbi Ishmael. Now we're talking about a pasuk from the Torah, not from the prophets, and it's about the land of Israel. V'yirashtem ota v'yashavtem bat, says you will inherit it and you will dwell there. So bamei yirashtem b'yeshiva, the fact that these two words are juxtaposed in the verse. How do you inherit? Inherit obviously means you gain rights to the land by living there. Okay, and therefore they say clearly sitting and living there is a way of doing a kinyan, of acquiring land. That was the first three parts about the first three ways of acquiring land. Now we're going to move on to how do we acquire movable property. We said meshicha, by pulling it. Where do we get this from? It says in a pasuk, again, we're going to have two possibilities here. The continuation of that pasuk, what it's saying is, if you buy something or sell something, there's laws of ona'ah. That means don't overcharge, don't underpay, etc. But what does it say here? Kano miyada mitecha. You buy from the hand of your friend. So what did they learn here? That there's kinyan when? From miyad, from a hand. Davar haniknya miyad liyad. It's something that can be passed from one hand to the other. So first of all, that's movable property. And what did we learn? How does it get passed? From hand to hand, which means you take it from your possession, you give it to me, and I acquire it by having it in my hand, which obviously means I can't just have it in my hand. I actually have to pull it or do something with it. Not so clear how it comes from the pasuk, but it's a way of connecting it to a verse. Now, there's actually a Morahitic debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish about whether by Torah law, this is a Torah law, that Mashiach is koneh, and money is not. Okay, so for example, if I pay for something on Amazon, let's say, until I get it, it's not actually mine. So I really could change my mind. Okay, and I could, right, all sorts of things. Again, it's not mine yet, which means, okay, let's think about it this way. What if the driver gets into an accident, the item gets destroyed? So Amazon has to provide me with a new one, right? Even though I've paid the money, right? Now here, it's different. There, I paid the money, okay? So now it's actually the same. It's not mine until it comes into my house. You know, if it broke the minute it came into my house, because I opened the box, it fell on the floor and smashed, it's obviously my responsibility because I did Mashiach. I brought it into my house, okay? But, right, big question, what if it, right? What happens if it gets stolen from my doorstep where Amazon left it? And that's why Amazon now sends pictures of, you know, we put it there. Don't claim that there's a problem. We're not assuming responsibility anymore. It's yours. It's in your domain. We're done. Okay. Even though I haven't done Mashiach yet, right? Halacha would say until I actually brought it in, maybe it's not mine. But, you know, laws nowadays, I assume, or at least they're trying to protect themselves, say, you know, you didn't bring it in. I'm sorry, it's in your domain. It's yours. So anyway, these are all very relevant questions. Now, Rabbi Yochanan thinks the ma'ot kono. As soon as I paid for it, it's mine. Even if the Amazon truck hasn't come to my house yet, it's my item. Which would mean, number one, I can't change my mind anymore. Number two, it means responsibility. If something happens to it, it's not Amazon's problem anymore. Now that creates a huge problem. And the problem is called, the way it's called, it comes up in the Gemara, Shema Yomar lo nisrefu chitecha ba'aliyah. We don't want a situation where the stuff, let's use Amazon, is in Amazon's warehouse, but owned by me. Because if Amazon has a fire in their warehouse, that's nisrefu chitecha ba'aliyah, you know, the guy will say, oh, listen, your wheat burned in my attic. And, you know, there was a fire, I left, and you know, it burned your tough luck. Okay? If it was owned by me, I would make sure to protect all that stuff, right? And I would do whatever I could to get that fire out and save my stuff so that I don't take a loss. But if it's yours, I won't care. I'll just leave my house and say, you know, to heck with your stuff. So we don't want that situation to happen. Is we want people to be responsible for things they should be responsible for. So therefore we say, guess what? Ma'oda konot, really, by Torah law, money is enough. But by rabbinic law, we're going to say not until the person actually pulls it into their domain. Because if it's still in my domain, I take responsibility for it. So they're now going to say, Rabbi Yochanan, Da'amar, Dvar Torah, Ma'ot konot, Ma'ika Lamemar. Well, if he thinks the Ma'ot acquire, then how can the Mishnah say she'en achrayut ein niknim ela b'mashicha? He thinks money acquires. That's not what it says in the Mishnah. So they say Tana takanta d'Rabbanan katane. The Tana was listing though what the rabbis instituted, because even Rabbi Yochanan, who thinks ma'ot konot, agrees that because of this problem of Shema Yisrafu Chitecha B'aliyah, right, or Shema Yomarlo, maybe I'll claim, oh, listen, your stuff burnt up in my attic, and I don't care, it's not my fault. So as a result of that, they made a takana, and the Mishnah is mentioning the takana. So therefore, there's no Torah source for this because it's rabbinic, but it is mentioned in the Mishnah because the Mishnah is mentioning the rabbinic takana, the ordinance. Okay, that's all the acquiring right now. Now we're going to move to this kinyan agav, this other way of acquiring. So we have kinyan, right, in land, kesef shtar and chazaka. We have kinyan on movable property, mashicha only, which is either a Torah law or perhaps only a rabbinic law. And now we move to this issue of kinyan agav, which is called agav is on the back of. So literally, agav is on the back, okay, as we use it, on the back of this. Now, what it means again is that if I'm acquiring both land and movables, then I can do a kinyan on land, which usually wouldn't work for movables, but basically we're going to say it'll go for both. So the first question is, where do we get it from? And then we're going to get to our big question that's going to take us through till tomorrow's daf. We're now quoting a pasuk about Yehoshaphat the king. He was a king in Judah, and it says that he was the father, gave his sons gifts with cities, okay, with these arei mitzvot in Judea. So what do you see here? It doesn't really talk about a kinyan, but it seems like the gifts were given through the kinyan on the cities. Okay, even though the pasuk clearly wasn't talking about the methods of acquiring, and it certainly wasn't a halachic pasuk, but we can derive it from there. Now, here comes our big question. Do the metaltalin, the movable property, do they have to be in the land, sitting on the property, or not? So for this, we're going to have today 3 sources, 2 more tomorrow, to try to get to an answer. So the first source and the 3 we're going to see today are all going to try to say they don't actually have to be there, but each one is going to be rejected, and they're going to say, no, it actually might. It might have to be there. Okay, you can't prove it from here. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Karka Kolshu, if you own a very small piece of land, it could be any small amount of land. Okay, the first few laws don't have to do with us. You already have to leave a corner of your field. Even if it's a teeny piece, you still have to leave a corner of it for the poor people. You still have to take your first fruits. Okay, there's a law of first fruits. If you have a tree in that little very piece of land, that very little piece of land, you'd have to bring the first fruits to the temple. Moving now to Amubet, you might remember we learned this in Gittin. In order to do a prusbal to allow you to collect your loan after the Shemitah year is over, normally the loans get canceled. You have to own land. There was a whole thing there where we said people gave people land often in order to write a prusbal, but the reason is because most people who loan money do own land because the landowners were the wealthier people, and therefore the takana was said in a typical case and not an atypical case. Here we get to our point. So remember, it started with any little piece of land. Any small piece of land can be used for kinyan agav to acquire metaltalin. Now, what does this prove? Why does this prove it doesn't have to be sitting on the property? Because if you think it needs to be on the land, a little teeny piece of land, what can you actually put in a little teeny piece of land that you could acquire along with it? So it means even if it's not there. But this has an easy answer. What do you mean? You can have something small. Maybe you put a needle into that little piece of land, and you're talking about acquiring the needle on the land. To which Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef really doesn't like this. Shmuel Bar Bisna said this to Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef's response is, Amalei Rav Yosef, Kavastan. So Rashi says that means, are you trying to upset me by giving such a ridiculous answer? Do you think that Tana would go so far to teach us a halacha about a needle? You think that Tana, this source, is going to say a karka kolshu can help you acquire and can be used to acquire a needle? Who cares about a needle that you're going to start making a whole source talking about a case that is talking about acquiring a needle? So Rav Ashi has a good answer for this. Amar Rav Ashi man le'malandelo Tana b'marganita deshavi al pezuzah. He was talking about a needle, but you could put on that needle a beautiful pearl that's worth 1,000 zuz, right? You could put all sorts of things that are teeny, that are worth a lot of money. Jewelry is usually small and worth a lot of money. So theoretically, you could be talking about putting jewelry on this pin, on this needle that's stuck into the ground, and that's what we're talking about. And that would be a case where metaltalin are acquired with land, even though the land is a very small piece of land. In any case, it could be this proves that they have to be on there. It could be, it proves they don't have to be, so we don't have an answer. Tashma, next source. This source is going to resolve the problem of the previous one, which they're going to say exactly what has to be on that land. And it's going to be clear it wasn't just a little pearl. Okay, what a madoni is, it's a good question. Maybe he came from Madon, some other possible answers. Anyway, we'll move on. Shaya b'Yerushalayim. So there was a guy who was in Jerusalem. He had a lot of property. He wanted to give them as a gift. Now, why he couldn't do Mashiach is a good question, okay? But he couldn't. For whatever reason, we'll see at the end of the daf a possible reason why. Amrulo, Eno takana, there's no way to resolve this. You know, the only solution is he can have the person acquire it through land. Me'asa, so what did he do? He took a piece of land that was a beit sela. We don't exactly know what a beit sela is. The Gemara is going to assume right now a sela is a coin. So the size of a coin of a sela, or maybe worth a sela, which wouldn't be a lot. I mean, a sela is not nothing, but it's certainly not a lot, certainly when it comes to land. So it was a very small piece of land near Jerusalem. So the northern part of this little piece of land that I just bought is going to be given to so-and-so, this guy he wanted to give gifts. He basically says, I'm giving this to you. And with that, I'm giving you 100 son, 100 of these small animals, you know, sheep and goats, and 100 barrels. What happened? Umate, and he immediately died. That must have been why he was pressured about this whole thing to get this done. And they said, it's acquired by that guy. Okay, now, if they have to be in the property, how could you possibly put 100 son and 100 barrels in a piece of land that's the size of a sela? No way, no how. To which the Gemara says, this doesn't really prove anything, because maybe you didn't understand what a beit sela is. Misabar beit sela, sela mamash, my sela de nakish tuva. Maybe a beit sela is actually a very big piece of land that actually could fit all of that in it. So why'd they call it a sela? Well, a sela is also not just a coin, but also a stone. De kashe kesela. Why did he buy this particular big plot of land? Because it was all rocky and it wasn't good for planting. So he was able to get a big piece of land that could fit all of his metaltalin for a very cheap price, because nobody else wanted to buy that land. And that's why it was called a sela, because it was a beit sela. It was a big plot that was the size of a sela. Okay, and then it could be that actually everything was on the property. So again, we can't prove either which way. Third and last source for today, Tashma. Now notice the first two were Tanaitic sources. This is an Amorit speaking, Rav. Okay, there's two possibilities. Either he was, let's talk before we even get to explaining this line. Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis have a disagreement, and we've seen this before also, about a shchib mincha, a person on their deathbed. If they say, I want to give this gift to so-and-so, is that enough? Or do they have to actually do a kinyan? So Rabbi Eliezer says it's not enough. You have to actually do a kinyan, even though you're on your deathbed. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, the story happened with someone who was on their deathbed, but it was Rabbi Eliezer who basically says it doesn't matter that you're on your deathbed, you have to do a kinyan anyway. Or the story was according to the rabbis who say, The words of a shchit me'ara are as if I say on my deathbed, I want to give my stuff to so-and-so, it's as if it's a done deal. Why? You remember this? Because we don't want someone on their deathbed to be all worked up that I haven't dealt with all my stuff yet, and maybe it'll even hasten their death, the worry about that. So we basically tell you, oh, don't worry, it's like it's a done deal. Well, if that's the story, then you don't need a kinyan, in which case this story must have been about a healthy person and not someone on their deathbed. Okay, so either which way, the point being, the person needed to do a kinyan here. So what was the story? Hayula metaltalin arbeit, just like the previous story. In fact, you had the same amount of metaltalin. It sounds like maybe just a different version of the previous story. Ubikesh litnam b'matana, he wanted to give them as a gift. Amrulo, they said to him, eno takana ad shiknem al gabei karka. The only way to do this is to acquire land, like sell them to someone, have them pass over to someone with land. Me'asa, so what did he do? Halach v'lakach beit rova, samuch liYerushalayim. He took a plot of land that was enough to grow a reva kav of produce, which is not a lot. V'amal, now here we're going to get the exact size, not like the previous case where the Beit Selah, we weren't sure how big it was. He says, tefach al tefach, okay? 1 handbreadth by 1 handbreadth. That's obviously a very small plot. Liploni, v'imo, and now we're going to resolve what we didn't have from the first source, me'atzonu me'achaviyah. So now we know exactly how much he gave him and exactly how big the land was. And clearly you cannot fit 100 son and 100 barrels in a land that was tefach al tefach. And mate, and then he died. V'kimu chachamim et dvarav, and they said, this is a done, right? This was good. So this seems pretty clear that a tefach al tefach is certainly not going to work to pass on all that property. If it was sitting there, that proves it doesn't need to be in the property. But the Gemara is still going to reject this. Maybe he was giving the gift to someone in money that was enough to buy him 100 son and 100 barrels. And then money could actually be piled up. That amount of money could be piled up in a tefach al tefach space. So rejection of that source. From now till the end of the daf, we're actually going to just question. We're going to first try to say we can even prove from the details of the story there was definitely money, and then they're not going to be able to prove it. Okay, so we're now leaving. In other words, we're leaving the basic sugya. We brought three sources to try to prove, does it need to be there? We tried to say from each source, no, it doesn't need to physically be there. In every source, we said it could be understood in both ways. And that's what we did here. Also, it could be understood in both ways. Now the Gemara is going to try to prove the second reading, but in the end, it's not going to be able to prove it. It just means the proof is inconclusive. But still, both possibilities exist, in which case, right, maybe it was money, and then it could have been sitting there, or maybe it wasn't money, and then it proves that you don't need it to be sitting there. But we don't know, so it's not going to help us. So let's see the proof, and let's see why they try to reject it. Hakinami mistabra can also prove this. Now they're going to point out this line, the only way to do this. What do you mean the only way to do this? You have another way to do it. You didn't have the matzon there, so he couldn't pull them all, but you could just do chalipin. Pick something up, use it as a symbolic act that, right, you can do that with movable property. Now, and you can't do it with money. So the fact that they couldn't do chalipin proves it must have been money. To which they say, okay, so now you want to say it must have been money because otherwise they could have used chalipin, because chalipin is not a good way to buy. You can't acquire money with chalipin. Elamai l'damis, you're going to say it was money. If that's the case, nikninu niale b'mashicha. If it was money, he could have just pulled the money. That's a way of acquiring money. Ella, so why didn't it work? If we go the money track, why wasn't mashicha an option? Ella delete lemakabel matana. It must be the guy who you were giving the gift to wasn't there. He wasn't physically there, and that's why you had to do it in this other way. He must not have been there. And that's why you didn't want to give him the money, because he wasn't there. You couldn't give him the money. For that same thing, that same price, right? Not price, literally, right? No pun intended, but you could have also done chalipin. So it doesn't prove money. It couldn't have been money because chalipin maybe could have been done, but couldn't have been done for a different reason because the guy wasn't physically there. To which the Gemara says, but I don't understand why. What's the problem if the guy wasn't physically there? We all know zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. You can pass on something to someone through somebody else. You could have given it to somebody else. Lo samchadati. He didn't trust that guy. He thought the guy was going to take it for himself. Savar shamit va'achile. He thought he was going to use it himself. Right? He didn't trust anybody else. So then they say, well, then it doesn't make sense, though, the wording of the source. Elamai ein lo takana. Ein lo takana means there's no other way. There is a way. He could have given it to someone else. He just didn't want to. To which the Gemara answers, Hachi Kamar. For a person who doesn't trust anybody else, he has no resolution other than no solution other than to give it to him through the land. And that's why in the end, he had to give it to him to the land, because what did he do? He could be makneh somebody else the land, and with that, all the stuff, but that doesn't mean that to give the person physically the money, the guy might pocket it himself. If he gives him this piece of land on behalf of somebody else, so then there doesn't seem to be that concern. And that's why this was the only way to do it. But it doesn't prove that it was definitely money. Okay, because we tried to prove it was definitely money, because otherwise they could have done chalipin, but they also could have done mashicha, and it doesn't really prove anything. In the end, we're left with a question. Okay, so what we had today again, kesef. How land is acquired, where we get it from, how metaltalin are acquired, where we get it from, what are the limitations of some of those, and then we talked about the kinyan agav, and we wanted to know, does it need to be tzvulin or not? And we don't yet know the answer. We will get to the answer in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom.